Good evening and welcome to Fowler Hall. I'm Catherine Mayo, a senior from Monticello, Indiana, majoring in history. Thank you for attending tonight's inaugural Jack Miller Center lecture, Identity, Politics, and the Future of Democracy, which is part of Purdue's Giant Leap series. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Jack Miller Center through support provided by Howard and Marilyn Witt, along with the College of Liberal Arts and the Department of History. We are grateful for Howard and Marilyn Witt's commitment to advancing undergraduate education in America's history, its political and economic institutions, and the central principles, ideas, and issues arising from the American and Western traditions that continue to animate our national life. Tonight's event will feature a conversation between Purdue University President Mitch Daniels and world-renowned author, political scientist, and political economics, Francis Fukuyama. Dr. Fukuyama received his Bachelor in Arts in Classics from Cornell University, where he studied political philosophy under Alan Bloom. He earned his PhD in political science from Harvard. Today, Dr. Fukuyama is a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and the Maz Bacher Director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. Among his many notable publications are The End of History and The Last Man, The Origins of Political Order from Prehuman Times to the French Revolution, and the topic for tonight's conversation, his 2018 release, Identity, the Demand for Dignity, and the Politics of Resentment. Now, without any further delay, please join me in welcoming tonight's speakers to the stage. Here are President Mitch Daniels and Francis Fukuyama.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome. Thanks to Kathy and the Jack Miller Lecture Series for this particular evening. As we so often do, I'll get the privilege of asking questions for a while, but somewhere in our second half hour there are microphones, and you'll be invited to line up and ask your own. And I know this is futile, but I'll try it anyway. Questions, please, not speeches, and preferably concise questions. And now feel free to completely forget that request, because people do. Welcome, Dr. Fukuyama. We've looked forward to this very much. It's going to be a genuine highlight of our 150th anniversary Ideas Festival. As Kathy says, your latest book is full of provocative questions, and I definitely want to get to them, but really do want to start back a ways. There are not too many essays or books or theories which capture the public imagination and are debated and thought of and remembered for a very long time, but you created one about a quarter century ago. And it was understood by some when you said the end of history, it was understood by some to mean that free institutions, liberalism in politics, free market capitalism in economics had triumphed then and forever. You've clarified that a little bit recently, but for those who haven't read it, talk a little bit about what you did mean,
okay,
and what it means today.
Well, President Daniels, first of all, thank you. It's really a delight to be at Purdue and to be able to talk about this with you. So this question about, well, what about the end of history? I've been asked that before on a few occasions. So I guess the starting point is to understand what I meant by the end of history. It was not my phrase, it was the philosopher Hegel, and then Karl Marx used it. And so history, in their sense, you could have a synonym of modernization or development. And so the question is, you have this big long-term evolution of human societies, where is it heading? And the Marxists had one particular answer, which is that it would be heading towards a communist utopia. Mm-hmm. That was the end of history for them. And in 1988, 89, when I wrote the original article, Gorbachev was in power in the Soviet Union. There's ferment all over the world. A lot of democratic revolutions were happening in Latin America, other parts of the world. And I said, hey, it doesn't look like we're going to get there. It doesn't look like we're going to get to communism. It looks like the terminal point is going to be some form of liberal democracy connected to a market economy. And I still think that the question is there a higher form of human political, social, economic organization that's going to supersede liberal democracy. And that I really don't see in the world right now. China, I think, is really the only alternative system that looks like it's a contender because they can master high levels of technology. They're growing very fast. But in the end, I don't think, nobody wants to move to China, really. I mean, they don't have an attractive society in many ways. So I still think that there's something to the thesis.
I may be reading him superficially, but if there's another essay, if there's been one in the last several years that seems to have caught the attention of people in much the way that your original work did, it's one that seems to take an almost polar view. So Robert Kagan recently wrote a piece called "The Strong Men Strike Back," which I understood to suggest that liberalism, as we've known it, now is in danger of eclipse from both the left and the right. He even suggests that authoritarians of the left and the right might be coming together in various ways. What do you make of his theory? Is it completely inconsistent with yours, or not?
Bob Kagan is an old friend of mine, and we've been sparring for a long time, and he's been writing that article for the last 25 years. Even in the 90s, when Bill Clinton was president, the United States was on top of the world. He was still worried that the world was much more conflictual. I think now he is closer to being right than at any time since then. I
Stop
think,
clock position.
something like that. I didn't want to say it, but I do think that now there is this unique combination of challenges where you do have these external actors like China and Russia that are authoritarian. They're very assertive, quite self-confident, and I think that that's a situation, a geopolitical situation that we've not had to deal with. And so in that sense, he is quite right. And then the other big development is this upsurge of populist nationalism, which is hitting not just externally the security of democracies, but it's happening from within.
Yeah.
By the way, your microphone is dropped down there.
Might be a blessing to the audience. Thank you. In addition to those two factors, you're here in one of the world's, we believe, centers of emergent technologies and in technological innovation, particularly in the information technology zone. There are tools available to tyrants now, or would-be tyrants, that weren't there before. Tools that George Orwell never imagined, I don't think. Does that change the possibility that Kagan is right about a long-term?
Yeah, I know. It's very worrisome, this Chinese social credit system, where basically it's as if every bit of information that Google and Facebook have about you is owned by the government, and they can use that to control your political behavior, not just what you eat for breakfast. That's quite scary. And there's stuff on the horizon. A friend of mine was going through a terminal in China in the airport, and he walks up to a camera, and it says, "Hello, Mr. So-and-so, your flight is on time, go to gate such and such." And he didn't say anything. It simply recognized his face. And that's just over the horizon. I think that we've not really seen this attempt by an authoritarian political government that is trying to control its citizens using that degree of technology. So I think we should be very worried about it.
Yeah, lots of carrots and potentially sticks for those who behave or misbehave as the government sees it.
And the thing is, it could be for something very minor. So you write some slightly critical thing on Weibo or on the Chinese social media, and all of a sudden you can't buy a train ticket to see your parents, that sort of thing.
Some assert that liberalism, as we've known it, is incompatible with tradition and culture as we've understood those terms, and that this may explain some of the friction in various societies today. You treat with this a little bit in some of your work, but could you explain that to the group and your views on it?
Well, liberalism is basically about the liberty of individuals. And the whole premise of our political system is that we're rights-bearing individuals who worry about the government taking those rights away, and we want to defend a sphere of individual liberty. I think, though, that the way that liberal societies have always worked is by being embedded in a society in which there are communities, in which people are not just selfish individuals, but they're in families, they're in neighborhoods, they're in workplaces, and they're political creatures who have a sense of obligation towards, public virtue, that they've got an obligation to look to public interest and not just to their narrow self-interest. And I think that there's always been this tension between the emphasis on the individual, which can either be me as a proud member of a democratic system who participates in thinking with my fellow citizens about the public good, or it can just be me, and I'm going to use the system to get what I want. And I think that tension has shifted over. I mean, the balance has shifted over to the second version of it, I think, over the last few decades, so that the idea of public virtue, the idea that we should be thinking about communities and the way we relate to people has been atrophying. And this makes people very uncomfortable because, in fact, we are not just selfish individuals. We really feel we're social creatures, and we feel intensely uncomfortable if we're not related to people, if we don't have a sense of belonging. And quite frankly, I think some of the very negative forms of belonging, white nationalism or some of the populist movements that you see is a direct response to the atomization of a society where we don't have structures that hold us together in communities, and we're desperately seeking for that, and we go find it in some form of extremism.
Yeah. Is there not also an economic dimension in that the very dynamics of capitalism, which has created the wealthiest world we've ever known, and without which we won't continue to progress economically, but it does dissolve structures and brings down old businesses or even old entire industries and sectors in a way that's very disconcerting and can really disorient people in that way.
No, absolutely, and I think that's the nature of globalization, which is just the extension of this kind of capitalism on a global scale, where you get some minor cost advantage by moving your factory to a different country, and you go ahead and do it because that's the way you maximize profits. And that happens regardless of its effect on communities or real world people. And then if you have a competitive system, even if you want to take a kind of socially responsible position, look out for your workers, try to protect the community that's nurtured you, if you do that, you face a competitor that is much more ruthless and doesn't have those concerns, and you lose out, you lose market share, and then eventually you go bankrupt. And so there is a problem, and actually I sort of think that that's why you need government, because the market by itself, I do think, if it's completely unconstrained by certain kinds of limits that governments can put on markets, and if it's not constrained by a certain sense of social responsibility apart from the government, you're going to end up with this very ruthless kind of capitalism. And I think that's, in a way, what we've experienced in this country over the last 30 years.
Well, some could say that it's the consumer who's ruthless. They want a less expensive product. People either meet that demand or, as you say, suffer the economic consequences. It can be seen in a little more benign terms.
If you go to other rich developed countries like Switzerland or Denmark or Japan, everything there is much more expensive, right? You buy a cup of coffee in a French cafe, it's it's like $6, $7, and what you're paying for is not the cheapest cup of coffee you can get. What you're paying for is the social system that supports your ability to sit in a cafe and talk to people and enjoy a certain traditional way of relating to your fellow Parisians, right? And we could take that trade-off if we wanted to. I really do think that, in a sense, people will be willing to pay more money if they understood, properly that this is what's needed to maintain a sense of community. So I do think that this is more of a societal decision, and it doesn't have to be quite as ruthless as as we've made it.
It is the exact argument that's made for protectionism, though, that we'll accept higher prices or inflict them on our customers because we need to preserve this industry or these communities that rely on it. And this is an argument that's going on in the country right now.
Yeah, well, I guess it really is in the the extent and the nature of it, because certain forms of protectionism are really designed to just keep alive completely inefficient industries simply because they're politically powerful, and they're not connected to community or a moral sense of what it is we're about. And by the way, we've never really had truly free markets. We Americans protect all sorts of things,
Right.
and in the interest of even before our current president, in the interest of in a way social stability.
Okay. I want to switch to your, I guess, most recent, certainly very fascinating book, Identity. And I start by asking you to define one of the central terms in the book. By full disclosure, I had to get my Greek pronunciation checked with Dr. Fukuyama, so themos. For those who haven't read the book, and shame on you if you haven't, talk about that a little bit, because it then underpins so many of the other interesting points you made.
Sure. So thumos is this Greek word that is often translated as spiritedness or pride. In Plato's Republic, Socrates is talking to these young Athenians, and he says, isn't there this third part of the soul? So we understand that there's the desiring part that wants food and drink, and there's a rational part that's able to calculate. But isn't there a third part that basically wants other people to respect us? And I think this is so this was written 2,500 years ago. It's something that actually modern economics has forgotten, because the economists get the rational part and they get the desiring part, but they don't have this part about the desire for dignity and respect. And I think that is really critical, because all of us, I think, as human beings, it's part of our natures, have this sense that we have an inner self that should be respected by other people, and we get very angry when people don't respect it, and it overrides our material interest. And I think that you cannot understand really what's going on in a lot of politics if you don't understand, this part of human nature. There's a modern form of it also that really puts this primary value on the inner self as opposed to the outer society. And in my book, I actually go all the way back to Martin Luther in a way to illustrate this point. So, what Luther said was that the external rituals of the Catholic Church mean nothing to God. The only thing God cares about is faith. And that's something you can't see from the outside. It's something that's inside us. And that is what's valuable in God's eyes, and not conforming to, saying the rosary or going to Mass and all these other external things that are created by society. And I think that that's the form in which many modern social and political movements have taken, that we have this inner worth, and a lot of times it's a collective one that needs to be recognized, and we're not the ones that have to change. It's the external society that's got to change. So if you think about the Me Too movement, right, that we are in the midst of right now, what women are saying basically is that, the people the men that do sexual harassment, sexual assault, are not respecting them, fundamentally not respecting them. They're not treating women as a whole human being who has a dignity that's based on her, experience, her talents, her background, her character, but they're only looking at this one, sexualized part of her, and that is a way of devaluing, that person. But the reason it's kind of like Martin Luther in a sense is that, the idea is not that these women then have to conform to those norms that the men are setting. It's the society that's wrong. It's the inner self that needs to be affirmed and respected, and all of those norms have to change. So this has been, I think, the nature of social revolutions, for a very long time in our society and our civilization, and we're still, undergoing it.
Correct me if I misremember, but I think a disquieting example that you gave of of a social movement spawned by inner direction was Nazism and Hitler.
Well, there's a lot of nationalism that's based on this. So, I need to state this right up front. The things that are similar between these different movements is the psychology. It's not the moral evaluation, right? So, obviously, nationalism led to a total disaster in Europe in the 20th century. However, what does a nationalist want? A nationalist says, my people, my cultural group, people that speak German or Serbian or Polish, are not being recognized because we don't have our own state. We're living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire or in some other political framework that does not grant us recognition by giving us our own political order, and that's our demand. We want to be recognized in that sense. And you think about Catalonia right now that's gone through something similar, that you had people that were living in this country called Spain, but they say, that's not enough for us. We are Catalans, we have our own language, we have our own cultural traditions, we're not Spanish, and we want to separate. And so that, I think, is an example of a very similar kind of feeling that this inner self needs to be publicly recognized in the form of political recognition.
I think I want to work our way back to national identity, which you have some very important things to say about, but I think maybe there's a way station en route there. You just gave the Catalan example. There have been a lot of separatist movements, one can think of Quebec and other places where people have shown an impulse to break down into more narrow identities. Now, you talk about a politics of resentment. And I think one wellspring of that, as I read you, is this tendency to seek out and demand ever narrower identities. And you suggest that hard to run a society that way.
Yes, it's very hard to run a society that way. So I think that this has been happening on both the right and the left in the United States. So in the U.S., so first of all, when I use the word identity politics, I have this very broad definition that includes things like 19th century nationalism. In this country, we tend to associate it much more narrowly with the politics of race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and so forth. But that's a subset of this broader category. In the United States, I think the reason that you have the narrow form of identity politics really comes out of social injustice. So beginning in the 1960s, you had social movements that grew out of the exclusion of certain groups. So the civil rights movement for African Americans, the feminist movement for women, there's a movement on behalf of the disabled, the LGBT rights movement. All of these groups were marginalized and excluded by a mainstream society, which in the early 1960s was basically white and male. And they're saying, okay, we want a place at the table. And they, pushed for inclusion, but in many of these movements, they came to understand their identities in these groups as somehow essential, to who they were. And the demand for recognition was really not recognition of them as individuals, but, recognition of their group. And I think that what began to happen, over the last 30 years is that the understanding of inequality began to shift, driven by these identity movements. So in the 20th century, who's the big object of concern on the part of progressive people on the left that want more equality? It's the working class. And in every rich country, that working class is basically, the dominant racial group. So there are white people in the United States. But with the rise of this kind of identity framing of that begins in the late 1960s, you get this focus on minority groups and other more partial identities. And this leads then to this big defection on the part of this old white working class away from parties of the left towards parties that recognize their identity. And a lot of the pushback is to say, hey, you forgot about us. You were talking about equality, but here we are, we're still here, we're still at the receiving end of, big capitalism and so forth, and you've forgotten about us. It's really remarkable if you look at what's happened to left-wing parties all over the world, including in this country. There's been this huge defection of working-class voters away from, like in the Democratic Party in the United States, under Franklin Roosevelt, probably 80% of rural whites in the South voted Democratic because Roosevelt was doing stuff for them. And that entire group has largely shifted over, and votes Republican now. And quite frankly, that's why Donald Trump got elected, because in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, enough voters like that switched parties and, got him over the bar in the Electoral College. Same thing's going on in Europe, where a lot of the left-wing parties have lost membership. The French Socialist Party has disappeared. The German Social Democrats have lost 20% of, their vote. And what's been gaining at their expense are these right-wing parties that now are casting these traditional, majority communities as victims themselves. And they're using the framing, borrowing it from the left and saying, hey, what about us? And I think the result of all of this is bad for democracy. It's bad in several senses, because first, I think that if you're arguing over economic issues, should the tax rate be, 45% or 35%, you can have a discussion about that. If it's, it's my identity or, yours, you can't split the difference on an issue like that. And then the other issue is polarization, where when you get hunkered down in your identities and you believe that your identity is under threat by other people in your society, you don't see other people as fellow citizens. You begin to see them as a different species of person. And unfortunately, I think this is where we've been heading in this country. It's what political scientists call effective polarization. So you're not just polarized over issues. You really hate the other, you really hate the other side. And you think they're evil people. They're not really Americans. They're traitors to, our fundamental values. And I think that's kind of where that's where we've been heading.
Witness the wisdom of what you just said. In this morning's paper, we read that leaders of what is left of the organized labor in the private sector, the organized labor movement, appealing to the Democratic candidates to not forget us. Please talk more about pocketbook issues and less about these causes that may or may not be of interest to the broad majority. So, if narrow and ever narrower identities are destructive of collective decision-making and effective governance, you do suggest an alternative. And I think at least one term you use is creedal identity, which it might be helpful to hear you talk a little bit about what that means and
Sure.
And why it's essential.
So national identity can be based on a lot of different things, and traditionally in the United States, if you look at the history of American identity, it was a racial definition, right? So before the Civil War, blacks, Native Americans, women, none of these groups could vote, and therefore they couldn't be full citizens. They were not treated equally. So what it meant to be an American was basically to be a white male, right? This leads to a civil war that killed 600,000 people, at the end of which you passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which in the 14th Amendment says, any person born or naturalized on the territory of the United States is a citizen of the United States, which enfranchises, all of the black slaves, former black slaves that had been liberated as a result of the war. So American identity changes very dramatically at that point. And it becomes creedal in theory. It becomes creedal that, what it means to be an American is simply to be born in the United States and then, to accept the basic constitutional values that give you rights as an American citizen. I think tragically, this is a promise that was not fulfilled in the U.S. for another 100 years. And it really took until the civil rights movement and the empowering, of African Americans, and then women had a similar issue in earlier decades, that you reach what I would call a creedal identity, which is an identity that is not based on a fixed characteristic like race, ethnicity, gender, It is based simply on your belief in a creed, an American creed that says we believe in the Constitution, in the rule of law, we believe in the principle in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, including all women, and with an expansive definition of who is in that magic circle of all men. And that's what it means, I think, to have a creedal identity. And it's very moving if you, I suspect you did this as governor, you go to a naturalization ceremony. It's very moving, because all these people from all over the world, from Korea, from Guatemala, from Vietnam, they take the oath, the naturalization oath, and then they say, I'm an American. And I think it was a tremendous achievement in our country that you could get to the point where you could do that, where it really didn't matter what your race or religion was. You could be an American as long as you signed up to this, this creed. In other countries, this is not true. In other democracies, this is not true. Mm-hmm. So in Europe, for example, if you talk about what it means to be German or Italian or Dutch, to this day, it has a very strong ethnic meaning. Mm-hmm. And if you're, dark-skinned and Muslim and not of the dominant ethnicity, it's very hard to say I'm German, Italian, Dutch, mm-hmm. Whatever. And I think this is a big problem for those societies because, in fact, they have become racially, religiously, ethnically very diverse. Germans used to say, we're not a country of immigration like you Americans, but now they have roughly the same proportion of their population born outside of Germany as we do. And so, my view is that a lot of other countries, so first of all, we need to defend our creedal identity, because you get these people, on the kind of alt-right that are trying to drag us back into a ethnic understanding of what it means to be an American. So we need to defend that, but I think other democracies need to have this sense of belonging and national identity that is not rooted in ethnicity and is really accessible to the actual diversity of people that live, that are citizens of their country.
No, it's been said you can live in, fill in the blank, France for a lifetime and not be French, but you can become an American in one day.
Yeah.
And it's also a common observation, because it's so valid, that some of the best Americans are the most recent ones. They appreciate the freedoms and the material blessings of this country in a way that some Americans have forgotten. And to get on the soapbox for the last time, most Americans who pass that naturalization test know more about the civic, the history and the civic systems of this country than too many Americans.
Yeah.
And somebody ought to work on that.
I mean, if you look at these surveys of what high school students in America know about the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, it's terrible. Yeah.
Yeah. Now but you do come down in the book on the place that a national identity is properly understood and adhered to, is the best way to operate effectively in a free society, and that this does require assimilation. And my European friends, who are very open-minded and progressive in the way we use that term today, however, do believe they have very serious problems with non-assimilation, and I think we see some of that here too. And so I think you do have a message to those who...
Yeah. Well, so this is the problem with, I think, certain interpretations of multiculturalism. So multiculturalism is a de facto description of, a diverse society, but it's also an agenda that, tried to argue that all cultures ought to be treated equally and given equal respect. And I think that that is right in the sense that, yes, we need to, we need to acknowledge that people come from different places, they've got different traditions, but it is not the case that every culture is compatible with a democratic society, that democracies have a certain kind of inherent culture that is necessary to sustain them as a liberal democracy. So, for example, the belief in fundamental equality is not something that's shared and I want to make this point really, really clear because I don't want to be accused of, well, I mean, it's tricky ground, but, you know, there are certain, you have Muslim minority communities. They're much more prominent in Europe than they are in the United States. And the problem is not that they're Muslim. The problem is that they've been influenced by this extremely conservative interpretation of Islam, Salafism or Wahhabism, coming out of Saudi Arabia, that basically, you know, does not accept, you know, women's equality, does not accept, you know, the equality of gays and lesbians, does not, you know, can be very anti-Semitic. All of these things, I think, are deviations from what we actually, I think, necessarily understand to be the basic requirements of a liberal democracy in which we, you know, we believe in those fundamental forms of equality. And so I think that if you have a community, you know, like that, that has that kind of particular interpretation of Islam, it's a real problem. And if they really don't want to become part of the broader society, what you're going to end up with is something like what you have in the Balkans, where you've got these communities that live in side by side. They really don't want anything to do with each other. And then every now and then they, you know, erupt into actual violence because they really don't have very much in common. And that's a situation I don't think any democracy wants to see develop.
It's not quite a 2-minute warning, but it's a 2-question warning. So those of you who have something they want to ask might want to begin migrating to the microphones for the last few minutes we'll have. I want to ask you well, since you just brought that up, let's start with this. You make a couple of, I thought, interesting points. You suggest, for instance, that Brexit may have been as much a phenomenon of identity as economics. You suggest that radical Islam of the murderous or suicidal sort might be as much a matter of identity as religion. Which is it?
Well, so in the case of Brexit, I think that what a lot of the Remain voters, the people that wanted Britain to stay in the European Union, didn't adequately recognize is the identity dimension of it. Because I think the single issue that was driving a lot of people to vote to get out of the EU was their perception that the EU was encouraging, you know, levels of immigration that were basically altering Britain's national identity in ways that British voters no longer had control over. And there's something to that because levels have been very high, like 900,000 Poles moved from Poland to Britain in a 2-year period, you know, in the last few years. And that's very rapid, you know, cultural change. And a lot of Brexit voters, when they were lectured, so a Remain advocate would say, you know, you don't understand basic economics, you know, you don't understand how disastrous leaving the EU is going to be. You know, the Brexit voter would say, well, first of all, I don't care if I lose a job even over this because I don't want my national identity taken away from me by all these damn foreigners. In any event, who the hell are you to be lecturing me like that? You know, as if I don't understand my own self-interest because, you know, the lecturer was some, you know, Oxford, Cambridge educated, you know, elite, you know, who really was looking down on that kind of person. So it's a dignity issue fundamentally, right? We have our identity, we want to keep it, and these elites are taking it from us. And I think, you know, with a lot of, especially European Muslims that went off to Syria to fight for ISIS, they also had this similar kind of identity issue because they, you know, they rejected the traditional Islam of their parents and grandparents, but they were never fully accepted in European society. And so a lot of them, you know, their personal stories, they were into petty criminality or drifting in and out of jail. And then all of a sudden you get a preacher that says, I'll tell you exactly who you are. You know, you're a Muslim, you're a member of this proud ummah, we're being persecuted, you know, all over the world, and you need to fight back, that's who you are. And in that sense, I think the conversion was not really a religious conversion. It was somebody settling this identity issue for that particular person.
One more. It's on the subject of religion. I guess it has two dimensions. Fascinating line in the book. I think I'm just loosely paraphrasing, but you said that therapy is now religion, and religion is becoming therapeutic.
That's right.
Talk about that for a minute.
Well, I think in a period when religion was much more powerful, organized religion. I mean, in the United States, it's still pretty powerful. But, there was a time in Western history where essentially, Christianity dominated the moral horizon. And if you had a problem, you went to a priest. And the answers that you would get to why am I lonely or why am I having, trouble, dealing with my spouse, the priest would have said, well, there are certain moral rules that you are not following, and God demands, the following of you, and that's the way you ought to organize your life and your behavior. With the decline of institutional religion in many Western societies, people still had these problems. They still felt lonely. They felt alienated, from their families, their fellow beings. There wasn't a priest to tell them, what to do, and instead you got psychologists. And I think that the religion, the ersatz substitute religion, was basically a religion of self-esteem, where you would be told by the psychologist, you're really a valuable person inside. Maybe people don't recognize that, but you need to feel better about yourself. And if you look, I don't want to name particular names, the religious figures that were hawking this kind of medicine. But if you listen to the rhetoric of a lot of people, religious people, they are using this language of self-esteem, and it's very un-Christian. My wife is very deeply Christian, and it drives her crazy because, the Bible doesn't say, yeah, you, and you're all worthy. You all deserve esteem. The Bible says no. Some of you are saved and some not, and you have to obey the law. And if you don't obey the law, that's a real problem for you. And there's no particular reason.
Well, that's not quite how Paul saw it, but
yeah.
But there was a tradition like that.
There was a tradition, like that, and
Yeah.
and I think that in a society where basically everybody deserves esteem, you don't have morality, essentially, because.
Well, that links to the last question I wanted to ask you. I was going to ask this question then anyway, but yesterday I read that a tipping point was just reached. A question's been asked in public opinion research forever about religious preference, and no preference was for the first time, was the number one choice in America, slightly outpolling Roman Catholicism and evangelical Christianity, so-called mainline Christianity, falling further. Now, that's a reality of our time, but maybe you were just intimating this, but when there is, your argument does say that the creedal identity and cooperation in a still free society requires certain virtues. And those were once defined
By religion.
And Friedrich Nietzsche had a lot to say about what happens when that goes away. And the strong decide what's moral and what isn't. That probably is not the society we'd hope to live in, but is it one that we have to worry about?
No, it is one, because I do think that people need virtue. I mean, you can't have a political system. You certainly can't have a democratic political system if people don't have a certain sense of obligation, towards their community and a certain sense of public spiritedness. I actually don't think that needs to come out of religion, because you can have other sources of virtue. I mean, there's a Republican tradition. This is not the capital R Republican, but it's kind of from the Roman Republic, where you are trained to be public spirited by your upbringing and your education. And I think that that's something that you can do, without necessarily reference to institutionalized religion. And it's necessary, I think.
Yeah. Well, maybe we better hope so. So let's. So this side's got here first and was patient, so please start.
Hello, Dr. Fukuyama. You mentioned that themos, or pride, right? And suppose there is a very evil government or high ruling class that they are able to remove this part out from your brain. And will that lead to a bitter end of history, or do you think it's still possible for humans to save themselves?
You know, it's interesting that you asked that. I wrote a book back in 2001 called Our Post-Human Future. This was the moment when they had just sequenced the human genome, and they were on the verge of being able to make different biomedical interventions. You know, it could be germline engineering, it could be through psychotropic drugs. You know, there are a lot of pathways to this. And one of the things that I worried about explicitly in that book was something like that, that totalitarian governments in the 20th century tried to use labor camps and re-education to get people to be compliant with their wishes, but they simply didn't have the kinds of technological tools that might become available in the future. And so one set of those tools are the ones that we've talked about in terms of information technology, monitoring, taking away people's privacy. But in the future, it could be through biomedicine. CRISPR-Cas9, this new gene editing technology, basically now it's made a reality of all the speculative things that we talked about back in the early 2000s that might come online in terms of our ability to actually alter human DNA. It hasn't happened yet, but I do think that's something really to worry about.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Great question. Let's take one more over here, and then we'll switch.
Since the rise of neoliberal policies of economics in our country, and looking at how that's sent us back to the days of the robber baron. In fact, there's even more money in the hands of the few at the top. Can you comment some on neoliberal policies and how do you see them regressing us back to a time of, less? Because there's people who can't raise a family and afford insurance for their own children under the policies this enacts.
So sure, it kind of depends on what you mean by neoliberalism. I mean, usually that's used as a term of abuse by people that don't like, particular policies. But I think that there was actually a certain reason why the world took a turn in that direction back in the 1970s and 80s.
No gold.
They were, you had many developed countries that were overregulated, and you had this period of stagflation in the United States where growth was slowing and inflation was very high because, countries were spending more money than they had and then trying to monetize their deficits, and that's what led to inflation. In Latin America and other parts of the developing world, this led to a total disaster. And so the original impulse towards what's now called neoliberalism was just doing kind of obvious things like don't spend more money than you've got, and live under a budget constraint, don't overinflate the money supply, and so forth. I think the problem was that got translated into a kind of extreme version which was based on ideology, basically, that said that, free markets will basically take care of themselves and you don't need a state. You don't ultimately need a state to regulate this. I think the area that this was the most disastrous in was in finance, because, the nature of finance is different from the nature of the real economy. It is able to inflict damage on the rest of the economy in the way that, a manufacturing industry or the manufacturing sector cannot, and we saw that unfolding, in the 2008 crisis when Lehman Brothers collapsed, and it basically tanked the entire global, trading system. And so I think that the problem, in my view, was not that certain economically liberal policies didn't produce good results. We had a quadrupling of global output as a result of free trade and, globalization between 1970 and 2008, but it was carried too far. And people forgot certain things, that free markets can really only prosper in the context of a political and social consensus that limits, some of the excesses. You have to have social safety nets. You have to have certain ways of protecting people against, the vagaries of the market, because if you don't do that, you're going to get mounting inequality, and I think that's kind of what's happened to us in that period since then.
Structure of the economy has an awful lot to do with it, too. Much of this has nothing to do with public policy as much as the winner-take-all aspects
Yep.
of a few
that's
people
right.
suddenly overnight billionaires and so forth. Over here.
Yes, thank you. I'm Jennifer Johnson, the Department of Anthropology. It's wonderful to have you here. Your end of history piece was the first one I ever read as an undergraduate 20 years ago, so it continues to be influential and lovely to see things come around. My first impulse was to ask you a question about global climate change and what kind of creedal identity would be maybe necessary for that. But then thinking also about what you've shared with us today, that something like white nationalism is actually a major threat to liberal democracy, or however we want to phrase it. And at the same time, returning to a sort of creedal identity based on a notion of man that is exclusionary of, as you outlined,
Yeah.
societal issues. On the basis of race or gender or sexual identity and those kinds of things. So I guess I'm asking to push a little more to think about how that might be thought of as revised, or how do we return to this original thing as a motivating factor when that itself is not prepared to deal with the kinds of challenges we have.
Well, I think you got to confront them. Like I was saying, I think this problem is a bigger one in Europe than in the United States, because I think that Americans still do accept some version of that creedal identity, although it's been framed, that the desire to think of yourself as fundamentally American, in addition to having these other identities, is a much weaker impulse than I think it was when I was a kid. I think that my solution to this is not to say that people should give up their partial identities, because every one of us grows up in a particular tradition. We have ancestors, and we have things that we remember about ourselves and where we came from, and nobody should be told that you got to simply deny the reality of that. I just think that political leaders need to focus a little bit more on integrative identities, like a creedal identity, and things that you hold in common, because I just don't see how you can have a democracy if you don't have a certain, at least minimal basis for trust within the political system, where people are able to deliberate, they can disagree about policy and about specific issues, but they have to believe that they're living in the same political community. They'll accept the outcomes of the institutions when they produce decisions and the like, and that's what I see is really falling apart right now, that we're increasingly not accepting that. And that's where I think we need this greater glue of, some form of sense of Americanness that restores a little bit of that, integration of the whole society.
Thank you. I think we've got just the right number of questions for the time we have left. So let's start over here and finish over here.
Good evening, Dr. Fukuyama, President Daniels. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your conversation with us all. My name is Alex Angel. I'm a junior studying history, biochemistry, and plant science. And
All right.
yeah, I'm a little bit busy right now. So it seems to me that the media is playing a role in the increasing polarization of society, when you look at different news organizations in particular. So you suggested the adoption of a creedal identity could be a potential cure to increasing polarization in society. How do you think that the media could help foster a sense of creedal identity? Do you think that would help?
It's not up to the media to foster a sense of creedal. So, where do identities come from? They come from a lot of sources. So some of them come from below. They're created at a grassroots level by the stories that people tell about themselves. I mean, I suppose the media has some role to play in this, but they're more of a transmission belt than an originator. So this has to do with writers, filmmakers, poets, artists that give people a common sense of who they are. And I think they are created from the top down. Some of it can be mandated through the educational system about how you teach, for example, the history of your society. But a lot of it is actually more subtle than that, where I think leaders actually lead by, by example. So one of the examples of this I give in my book is, if you've watched the movie Invictus, where Morgan Freeman plays Nelson Mandela in 1996, when South Africa, this newly free democratic South Africa, was hosting the Rugby World Cup. In that society, all of the blacks played soccer and the whites played rugby. And Nelson Mandela felt that it was important for his fellow South Africans, to root for the national rugby team, because that was a unifying symbol of this new rainbow, multiracial country. And it was a big struggle because a lot of the other blacks in the ANC said, why the hell should we root for these racists that have been holding us down for all of these years? But I think that's kind of an example of leadership that that creates identity. The film Ken Burns' film Baseball actually shows that the people that pushed baseball originally in the late 19th century deliberately wanted this sport as a kind of antidote to the polarization left over from the Civil War, so that people would have something other to think about than the wounds of that war. And so there are lots of ways that leadership and then kind of grassroots creativity can foster national identity. As I said, I think the media is largely just a transmission belt, and it's not a kind of independent actor in that kind of a story.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Marin Lynette. I'm in the Department of English. This question goes back to your work in bioethics. And you mentioned earlier that we're rights-bearing individuals. I was just curious what you think grounds human rights. There's a debate about whether it comes from us being a species or from certain capacities that we have. And I was wondering where you stand on that.
Yes, I had a prolonged debate with Richard Schultz, the head of Amnesty International, about this. It was like the leading global human rights organization. And the argument was, where do rights come from? And I believe that you actually have to ground them as, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, a lot of early modern thinkers did. You do have to ground them in a certain sense of, human nature, like the right to life, in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness actually comes from Hobbes and his observation that one of the most powerful human instincts is a instinct to self-preservation. And that if a government violates, that, and the fear of violent death, is one of the most powerful motivating characteristics. And in Hobbes's view, this is part of human nature. That's part of the human, universal kind of human equipment, so to speak. And so I do think that rights, do have to be grounded in a certain understanding of nature. There's no easy translation of that nature into political rights, but I do think that connection exists. The debate I had with Schultz is he said, no, it's just whatever society says they are, that societies can basically decide that some things are rights and others are not, and it historically evolves over time. And what I said to him is, well, why the hell is, your organization protesting violations of human rights in China if, the Chinese have their set of traditions and they don't respect individual human rights? You've got no grounds for saying that they shouldn't do that because, they can make up whatever set of rights they want. So I think it's a real weakness, at the core of the way we think about human rights, this issue of whether they are in fact universal or whether they're culturally grounded. And I've come down on the universal side, and I'm willing to debate that with people, but I have to admit it's a pretty difficult argument.
Thanks.
Would you be open to extending those universal rights to, say, gorillas or other primates?
I think that you can have a very intelligent discussion about that. I don't think that you would allow gorillas to vote, but I do think that you would probably recognize that maybe they have a level of consciousness and they can think about things and suffer and remember in ways that, have a certain resonance for human beings, and that we ought to respect that, right?
Real quick.
Real quick, thank you for being here, both of you. I've actually read President Daniels' book, and I haven't read Dr. Fukuyama's book.
I have to question your judgment now, but but I'll reserve that till I hear the question.
Well, I bought your book, so I will be reading it
Okay,
soon.
good, good.
So my question is, there's two kinds of immigration. One in which you spoke about how people come into the US, they take an exam and they say the oath, but also there's also uncontrolled immigration. So I think what's going on in Europe is they're letting a lot of refugees come in, which has good ethical reasons for doing so. But either way, the consequences, you have a large population of people in Europe who may not share the same moral axioms and culture, and this culture may not be conducive to the kind of democracy which Europe has right now. So is it fair to say that uncontrolled immigration of this form is a great threat to democracy, maybe even more so than white nationalism or any other forms of threats?
Well, potentially. I think there are two separate issues. So one is, are immigrants ultimately going to integrate into your society in the sense of accepting the basic democratic principles? And I think there's something to worry about in Europe, not so much here, but I do think in Europe. But the other issue is just the illegality itself. I really think that a lot of the opposition to immigration is not driven by racism and xenophobia. It's driven by the sense that this system is out of control. And that's true both in this country and in Europe. And I think that if you want to prick this populist bubble, you need to peel away people that are actually open. Okay, so this is a good statistic that you should absorb. A pretty substantial majority, like over 60% of Americans actually think that immigration is a good thing, and that number has been growing. But a majority of Americans also think that illegal immigration is a really big problem. How do you square those two? So I think there's actually a substantial number of people that are not opposed to immigration. They just don't like illegal immigration. I would say that there's something similar going on in Europe. So I do think that the state control over immigration is important, and both we and the Europeans need to, fix that problem.
So you have the honor of the, thank you, and you have the honor of the last question then.
Thank you. Dr. Fukuyama, I was curious, in your talk you talked about cultural compatibility, and I was wondering how exactly you define that in the context of liberal democracy, especially given a lot of inherent contradictions we can see in liberal democratic societies, like, for example, the alt-right and the white supremacy movement. We've seen them grow in many liberal democratic societies. And especially given the context of the recent New Zealand attacks, a white supremacist terrorist attack. Mm-hmm. How do we define cultural compatibility, especially when...
Yeah, I mean, it's not compatible. I mean, if you're a racist and you want to kill people just because they're a different race, that's completely incompatible with your commitment to basic, equality. So there's no, I mean, you got to put these people in jail. You got to, you got to find them and not let them do that.
But they came from these liberal democratic societies themselves. So how...
I mean, liberal democracies produce, a lot of crazy people, right? But, they also have certain principles, and you got to make people follow those principles. So I think it's not that difficult an issue.
Well, we could have hoped to end on a more uplifting note, I suppose. But I don't think for an instant it changes my view, and I'm guessing yours, that we've been fortunate to be in the presence for the last hour of one of the great minds of our country and one of the most illuminating thinkers around. And thank you, Dr. Fukuyama.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fukuyama and President Daniels, for an engaging conversation. We'll give them one more round of applause. On behalf of the College of Liberal Arts and the Department of History, thank you so much for joining us this evening and for tonight's Giant Leap Series event.